states, does any rational person really dispute that the planet is in deep shit? Global urban population is increasing by over 1 million a week, and more than half already live in cities, expected to hit 3/4 by mid-century. Half of these are in slums, and the gap between rich and poor grows ever greater. Default solutions, megacities, sprawl, mass migration, and promiscuous location, are nightmares. Cities too big are ungovernable, alienating, threatening, wasteful, unsustainable. Market-driven bottom-line locational choices promote global social disruption and insecurity as jobs chase low wages and our urbanity pursues privilege for the so-called creative class. And that's us. And the planet simply cannot keep up with our rates of consumption and waste. Last year, 1.5 million Chinese died from air pollution. 1 billion people can't get a clean glass of water. 1 in 9 is starving. But we all pay the price. The acid in the pristine lakes of Norway is gassed out by coal plants in Hebei, and the breeze from Fukushima irradiates us all. As the ice cap melts and the seas rise, they will not simply submerge the subsistence farmers of Bangladesh, but will also wash out the high rollers in Singapore and Miami Beach. We each know some version of this grim truth. If everyone had the ecological footprint of the average American, the land area required to actually provision each of us, we'd need 4 planets right now to survive. Well, these are not simply urban problems, but cities are distillation machines. They concentrate. If we architects and urbanists have the equivalent of a Hippocratic oath, it's this: a pledge to create places that are sustainable, equitable, and beautiful. But how? To begin, we must continuously negotiate our role and our relevance. Despite our dreams, we are not the hegemons of the urban, and must be wary of top-down fantasies and of too easily confusing form and effect. Political power seldom comes our way, and Haussmann, Speer, or Moses must be renounced as models of practice. The ultimate right to the city and its form belongs to its citizens. Well, nice theory, but a somewhat thornier practice, and I certainly don't mean to suggest that we professionals are invariably subordinate. We lay down vital armatures, create the economic, intellectual, analytical, and physical circumstances for the project of the city, and must do so at a magnitude commensurate with the question and the crisis. That our collaboration is contingent and constantly shifting shouldn't obscure what we do, nor its vital basis in consent. Real planning must come from the unending dialectic of top-down and bottom-up. But we face an even more dramatic risk, that the city is simply disappearing. As the actual project of urbanization takes the form of the repetitive construction of massive but commonplace infrastructures, thousands of identical apartment towers, skyscraper-clotted central business districts, giant highways, airport-free zones, we identify the city with another territoriality, the ubiquitous ooze that is the characteristic spatial product of neoliberal multinationalism and its global zoning, a phenomenon that not simply ratchets up and conceals the idea of centralized planning, but militates for a dreadful uniformity of place, one that threatens the freedom and individuality of us all. These phenomena, including the megacities that aggregate them, are precisely, I want to argue, not cities. And we must hold the line against either purely operational notions of what constitutes urbanity, the city is no more than the sum of its infrastructures, and insist that both the expressive and the social, the democratic possibilities of urban space, are at the core of what distinguishes the idea of the city and its practices. And I think we must be especially wary nowadays of the seductions of the so-called smart city and its focus on strategies of surveillance and control rather than on the means of citizen empowerment and on environmental and cultural sustainability. The city seen as the ground for participation suggests another model with a powerful grip on the urban imaginary: informality, the dominant urbanism of cities in the developing world. Informality purges planning from the charge of domination by foregrounding self-help and participation. Can we use its methods? The question locates central issues of urban politics and empowerment, but we too often have romanticized one-dimensional relationships to these places, whether based on their visual complexity, cubist compositions tumbling down the hillsides of Rio or Bogota, or on some fantasy of the liberated lives of their inhabitants. Today's do-it-yourself and tactical urbanism are attempts to reinvigorate community control in our own cities and to gain purchase in an environment in which that damn 1% seems to hold all the cards, to advance a kind of active collective intelligence that's very different from the centralized brain of the smart city. But how can we reconcile the actual misery of squatter settlements with their communal dynamics, technical ingenuity, self-initiation, economic creativity, tight bonds of necessity, and open-ended formal invention without actually ratifying the end product? Our ambition should not be to reproduce Dharavi or Soweto as a final state, nor to assume that a permanent, if dynamic, condition of organized squalor is the best we can do for the city. The risks of relativism are too great, and the results are too meager. There's an image that's been making the rounds: the squatter occupation of the abandoned Torre David in Caracas, that's alternately interpreted as a self-enfranchising utopia or as a J.G. Ballard high-rise nightmare. This spectacle stands in the highly ambiguous place once occupied by the famous walled city of Kowloon, insane in its density, romantically outlaw, a desperate, filthy riposte to the shiny, sunlit hygiene of repudiated modernist urbanism, as well as a kind of nasty Orientalist summa of the libertine degradation of the other. Well, there is something inspiring about this. It's simply not the answer. There have to be choices between the heroic yet squalid insubordination of the now displaced heroes of the Torre David and the unelected misery of the slums. Simple normalization is not the solution. I'm hardly the first to argue that the answer may not be to draw squatters deeper and deeper into the system a la Hernando de Soto, by miring them in credit, bank cards, land titles, and the disabling appliances of capital that further ratify their apartheid. But it's surely critical that we do something. This begins, I think, with recognizing that a purely informal sector doesn't actually exist. Formality and informality are both conceptual ghettos, taking shape in the imaginary to reinforce and reify a set of practices with ever-shifting uses. The lives actually led in these settlements almost always combine survival strategies that cross between these illusory sectors all the time, in the way people find and build housing, receive their educations, earn their livings, take their pleasures. And it is to these complex negotiations that we must look. Whatever genuinely advances freedom and opportunity is a tool, a tactic worth wielding. A key question raised both by the patterns of megacities and of informality is density. And distributing density at planetary, regional, and urban scales is one of our core challenges, certainly here. Today, density is being revisited under our reshaped sensibility of sustainability. And from this perspective, it's clear that too little density can be as problematic as too much. The downsides of the sparse suburbia that continues to be the main pattern for the growth of US cities and the embodiment of the American dream include infrastructure costs greatly exaggerated by distance, total dependency on private cars, thwarting of the material and thermal efficiencies of compact design, and a hyper-privatization that precludes a legion of public possibilities. There's a phrase used by those seeking affordable suburban housing in the US: drive until you qualify. This encapsulates the dilemma of someone with a fixed amount of credit who must travel further and further towards the urban periphery to find a home that she can finance. The result may be the purchase of that fantasy of house and yard, but the cost can be a commuting time of 6 or even 8 hours a day. This kind of uncontrolled growth of both slums and suburbs has to be confronted head on. Istanbul, third fastest growing city in the world, expands voraciously in every direction, dominating the national economy and remaining too attractive for its own good. Likewise, because of the lure of jobs and possibilities, impossible Mumbai grows at twice the rate of Maharashtra, its surrounding state, and at 2.5 times the rate of India as a whole. In China, the authorities have designated Beijing a super city with a population of 150 million, a single city with as many inhabitants as the whole of the United States in 1950. Is this wise regionalism or centralization run completely amok? But even these enormous stories don't tell the whole story. Dhaka, which may be the fastest growing city in the world, is surely urbanism in extremis. With a population somewhere north of about 17 million people, it isn't simply sprawling, it's densifying insanely, with over 115,000 people crammed into every square mile. Mumbai is more than 30% less dense than Dhaka. Hong Kong, 33%, Manhattan, 40%, and the greater New York conurbation is at least 90% less dense. In Dhaka, as elsewhere, the greatest densities are in the slums. And I've recently seen an estimate that some of these reach a seemingly impossible 4,200 people an acre, which would work out to about 2.5 million people per square mile. Of course, urban density must be seen with some nuance. Obviously, a collection of well-heeled people living large in a glittering New York high-rise will have a different relationship to the idea of density than a comparable number packed into a fetid chawl in Mumbai. Depending on both its constituents and its opportunities, a crowd assumes very different qualities in different contexts. A Parisian boulevardier experiences 100 people in near proximity as fascinating, while a child lost in a dark alleyway in Jakarta or Newark will have a very different feeling indeed. How to set limits? There's a graphic in circulation paralleling the famous pessimistic multiplying planets I showed you earlier, depicting the allegedly liberating claim that all of the world's city dwellers would fit in Texas if the entire state were built out at New York densities. But what does this proposition actually mean? All of Texas could fit into Manhattan at Kowloon densities, an even more horrific prospect. Not to mention that if we all become Texans, and this is for you, Marina, if we all became Texans, Rick Perry and Ted Cruz would rule the world. The point is to use space wisely. Density marks a distributive choice, not simply a goal. We've long recognized the special logics of sustainability and sociability that cities uniquely deliver. And one of the components that enables this is density, up to a point. But although both size and density ramify in many directions, they do not fully come to grips with the most enormous problem we confront, the grotesque gap between rich and poor, that oft-told tale of two cities. Today, the average price of an apartment in Manhattan is over $1 million, and globe-trotting plutocrats seem to think nothing of parking $100 million on our rising billionaires' row. Super tall buildings lording it over the city like San Gimignano on steroids. At the same time, as a recent study reveals, a person employed at the current U.S. minimum wage cannot afford an apartment anywhere in the city of New York. Sadly, our own architectural creativity is too much dedicated to this 1% of the 1%, and far too many of our starchitects are content to simply monumentalize the income gap. Sustainability is a fundamentally political question, and for many, green has become the new red. But like those uncritical claims for density, sustainability is too often used to obfuscate the question of inequality. The anger of many developing countries at having this universal value piously shoved down their throats by governments that have spent 2 centuries dumping carbon into the air and stripping resources from their colonies is understandable and critical. Our pieties about LEED platinum ratings are surely pretty meaningless to that 1 in 7 who must survive on an income of less than $1.25 a day. The crisis is not simply about rich nations and poor, but it reproduces itself internally and rampantly within both developing and developed economies. According to a widely circulated 2014 report from Credit Suisse, Russia, having abandoned its former egalitarian ideals, now has the world's highest rate of inequality. The top 10% own 85% of the country's wealth. Turkey, of all places, comes in second at 77.7%. The US, at 74.6%, is number 7, just behind Thailand at 75%, and just above, wait for it, India at 74%. Congratulations to Bangladesh for a mere 27% ownership by the top 10. Strikingly, however, national calculations of ecological footprints often yield a very different hierarchy than measures of inequality like the Gini coefficient. Here, for example, despite their comparable concentrations of wealth in the top 10%, the US and India are not even remotely close. The average American footprint is around 6.8 hectares per capita, while the average Indian only needs about 0.9. How to interpret this? One way is to describe Americans as piggish usurpers and Indians as model environmental citizens. Well, this is true to a degree. Any resolution of the twin problems of deprivation and inequality must take place on both supply, where Americans excel, and demand, where Indians outperform sides of the equation. But neither starvation nor gluttony is the answer. And Americans must learn to live more like Indians if Indians are to have the opportunity to live more like Americans. This isn't simply an efficiency problem, a condition that can be cured by political strategies for sharing existing wealth and its styles of production. Nor can we count on technology, another green revolution, cheap desalination, lean manufacture, industrialized building, to continuously unlock the Earth's potential. Looked at within their national borders, both Americans, despite enormous productivity, and Indians, despite pervasive austerity, produce dramatic deficits in terms of their total national biocapacities, the combined measure of both the possible levels of production of biological materials on land and water, and of the ability of the collective ecosystem to deal with the waste it generates, like carbon dioxide and sewage. The current biocapacity of the US is about 3.6 hectares per capita, which yields a shortfall of 3.1 for each of us. In India, biocapacity is only half a hectare per capita, with a resulting deficit of 0.4. The US is 3 times the size of India, but there are 5 times as many Indians as Americans, which means the aggregated deficit of the US is merely twice that of India. The huge actual discrepancy between the two countries is thus to be found both in dramatically different individual rates of consumption and in the range of resources available to deal with supplying these needs and desires. One thing that's clear, though, is that as a global matter, there's much more elasticity on the demand side than there is on that of supply. Earth's bearing capacity is finite, and our architecture and urbanism urgently need to recognize this and to respond. What then is to be done? And more relevantly, how can cities help? We all know the wise bromide, think globally, act locally. The formulation, if not the phrase, is often attributed to that fascinating character, Patrick Geddes. Geddes was a Scottish biologist and city planner who pioneered the understanding of the relationship of cities and what we now call the environment. His great contribution was in articulating an idea of the local that was embedded in the specifics of region, a recursive notion that he made graphically clear in his famous image of the valley section. Geddes has a special relevance, not simply for clarifying the dimensions of our environmental crisis, but for identifying a broader issue of cultural identity embedded in our relationship to place. At the very beginning of the 20th century, he saw a growing rupture between culture and authenticity, a problem we recognize both in the inevitability that wherever we visit, we stay in the Ibis, Novotel, Hilton, Holiday Inn, Radisson, or where am I staying? Meridian, and more darkly, in the murderous behavior of those who seek to secure their own identities by expunging the people, practices, even physical remains of the cultures they revile. I believe we must both renew existing cities and build new ones, and lots of them. One of the bugaboos of the politically correct, however, is the master plan. Stinking of patriarchy, authoritarianism, insensitivity, and the hubris of every kind of overreach, this territory of expressive inquiry is simply too suspect. We often look at representations of new cities and quarters in their all at once as a kind of pornography, the gaze that maligns and entraps. For many years, these representations have often come in a kind of protective dystopian wrapper, reinforcing the idea that the visionary is evil by definition. I've been teaching urban design for quite a long time, and I often ask my students to make images or bring in images of ideal cities. And there was a long and troubling period where a large percentage brought in a still from Blade Runner, The Fifth Element, or Tomorrowland, images of undeniable graphic power, but ultimately sinister meaning. I, however, grew up in a sunnier version of utopia. And the idea of the new town, conceived in the all-at-once, has always been on my mind. My very first architectural model, sometime in grade school, was of Brasilia. Unable to think of another way of constructing a dome, I used half a grapefruit for the Congress Hall, an obvious early example of my commitment to green architecture. I pawed repeatedly through Mumford's The City and History to get to the plates with the images of that prototypical Swedish new town, Vällingby. Later, I actually visited. I spent 6 months on a kibbutz. My childhood was passed in an idyllic modernist suburb of the formidably planned Washington, D.C. I was a volunteer at that great temporary intentional community, Resurrection City. I did miss Woodstock. Somebody said, "You want to go to a music festival?" I said, maybe not this weekend. But was certainly part of the nation of its fellow travelers, simultaneously immersed in the spatial politics of both the out there and the ameliorative. I worked as an advocacy planner and a minor municipal official. I was a squatter in London. I was equally stimulated by Archigram and Jane Jacobs, and still am. I see no contradiction. Both styles of thinking are deeply relevant, and true ecological thinking always suggests expansiveness and inclusion. Now, I'm not trying to take a moderate position here to split the difference. I want to argue that work on the city can begin anywhere where some heart and mind-felt certainty is found. I believe that neither the dominant deductive style of planning. We begin with a general program, proceed to a morphological frame, and finally get down to designing the doorknobs. Nor the more open-ended inductive style, start with a memory of a sunny day in Venice or Cartagena, or with some form that insistently insinuates itself into your sketchbook. I believe neither of these is enough. The process has to be dialectical, mutually interrogatory, a framework that applies not simply to questions of scale and direction, but also to styles of participation. Equity demands the most varied and fluid forms of both imagination and of representation. Our cities, new and old, must address the triple crisis of a degrading environment, rampant inequality, and threatened cultural difference. Because of their scale, ecological complexity, productive capacity, relative autonomy, and expressive singularity, cities are especially powerful and tractable increments for social and environmental accountancy, organization, and empowerment. One of the things powerfully revealed in the huge discrepancy and variation between income inequality and footprint size is precisely that nation states are not the most competent actors in addressing this dire situation. Witness only the horrors of today, the tsunami of mass migration as millions flee sites of poverty, warfare, and hopelessness towards the magnetic attractions of places of prosperity and stability. The result of the enormous global mismatch between biocapacity and social capacity is something we simply have not been able to work out at the national level. Whether it's the raw economic colonialism of the Chinese as they buy up farmland in Africa or minerals in Australia, the free trade nostrums of the multinational economy in which capital flows to sites of maximum exploitation, or the fundamental inability of so many states to provide people with the minimum necessities of life, the system is indifferent to the actual limits to growth, to coin a phrase. Lebensraum is a zero-sum game. For many years, my own studio has been trying to imagine and design cities and their elements that are harmonized, localized, bounded, founded in neighborhoods, and mixed. It's especially critical to think radically about mix, and the most difficult and critical task for urban planning, design, and governance is to artfully and equitably finesse and nurture the mixtures of people and activities in place and to provide for them. In our vision of the good neighborhood, we seek to maximize autonomy, including both social life and basic respiration. In this view, a successful neighborhood is both highly sustainable environmentally and a place in which all the necessities of daily life, work, recreation, education, commerce, culture, and so on, are available within an easy walking compass of home. Most planners pay lip service to this idea, but not to its fullest implication, which is, if everyone in the neighborhood can walk to work, everyone who works in the neighborhood must also be able to live there. The banker and the barista, the teacher and the student, the janitor, the artist, and the electrician. This simple principle has fairly radical implications. So I'm now going to, now we get to the architectural part of the lecture. At last. I'm going to show you three projects. One from '94, one from 2010, and one ongoing. These occupy very different conceptual spaces, but all deal with questions of urban autonomy, in two cases via the creation of entirely new cities or quarters, the first one fantastical, the second somewhat more conventional, and in the third through the retrofit of an existing city. All are projects that are represented in a projective all at once, indispensable, I think, as stimulus and as propaganda for possibility. Of course, we are effectively creating new cities all the time. China is doing it the old-fashioned way, finding empty sites, constructing massively, planning a long march of urbanization that will move 250 million people into towns in the next 10 years. This kind of accelerated single-form construction has historically been typical in the US too, where suburban sprawl and its reformulation as the edge city have created new patterns of movement and distribution of uses, but little change in density, inefficiency, or alienation. However, that the future of the city is unpredictable should not discourage us from speculation about the right now. Too much contingency yields an oppressive uncertainty. Too little simply imprisons us. WEED is a project for the design of a new city on a small part of an existing military base near Yuma, Arizona. Sited along an artificial lake on the lower Colorado River and adjoining abundant agricultural land, WEED embodies a set of motherhood issues that characterize all our work on city design and are the bedrock of sustainable urbanism. To begin, the town is car-free, vehicles relegated to the periphery, with benign means, walking, the inevitable alpha, used for internal circulation. To enable this, the town is strictly bounded, edges fixed. Its structure is based on a series of neighborhood-scaled increments, based on a 10-minute walking radius, or 20 minutes from the edge of the desert to the edge of the water, that locates both centers and other distributed facilities and public spaces, a basic unit of accountancy for complete neighborhoods. Beyond that, the organization is, to put it mildly, complex, and enables, among other things, one of the salient opportunities of the good urban life, getting lost. Despite their somewhat wild appearance, the drawings for WEED are meant to be read as precisely as possible and are drawn to scale. The map of differences is authoritative, suggesting both size and variety. Thus, while we don't specify what the meaning of the differing shades of blue and green might be, ornamental garden, constructed wetland, picnic ground, swimming hole, fish farm, we do propose a highly particular density of differences. It should be clear that the remix of green, blue, and built spaces represents a fairly radical divergence with contemporary practice, dramatically skewed greenish. The architecture may be strangish, but it's also precise. WEED is imagined as a loft based on an idea of a kind of architectural stem cell, space without assigned use but ready to assume any. This isn't exactly far-fetched. The discourse of flexibility and equipotentiality, as they called it when I was in school, has been a staple of modernist fantasies about architecture, and the experience of the post-industrial city has shown increasing possibilities for an adaptable, dramatically mixed distribution of uses. The loft idea that arose in the 60s and 70s combined two distinct, if related, streams. The first was the more ideologically driven idea of flexibility that found its most dramatic expression in buildings like the Pompidou Center, with its fantasy of subdivision, the idea that from a very large and essentially undefined space, with services near at hand, a variety of more bespoke environments could be carved. This paralleled the discovery of loft living in abandoned urban industrial zones, most classically Soho in New York City, where the occupation of former factories became a kind of ideal for the artistic life, rife with implications of freedom, abundance, and the recovery of the righteous vibe of a vanished industrial class. This anything possible condition is also vividly present in informal settlements, both in the intensity of their mix and in the extreme adaptability of their simply built structures. In both Paris and New York, though, architectures that appeared flexible actually proved rigid and far less tractable than touted. In the case of enormous buildings like the Beaubourg, not to mention the giant floor-plated office buildings still typical of corporate America, the very vastness of the space and the long distance to its daylit perimeter were efficient only according to a soulless bureaucratic model. Likewise, the much smaller lofts of Soho were constrained by the limitations of their original construction. Party wall buildings with decent light at one end and not much more than an air shaft at the other, they worked well, unsubdivided, but failed when their action painter inhabitants spawned offspring and required private spaces, extremely difficult to provide with adequate light and air. Weed, with its highly formalized informality, investigates an idea about lofts that are differentiated through aggregation rather than through subdivision. The idea is that spaces can be more particular, more individual, if the medium from which they are produced is complex and resistant and provokes unexpected opportunities. Still, these spaces of unspecified use but open potential can be designed with exact characteristics. One of the arguments of the project is that architecture and the city find their basic forms and sizes in relationship to the fundamental needs of the body and of sustainability. Human dimensions and their environmental requirements are not obscure. We conduct our activities face to face, and our spatial needs and habits of both gathering and isolation have been developed down the millennia. Buildings designed for daylight and cross-ventilation, the bedrock of sustainable architecture, will tend to fall within a narrow range of lengths and widths, and the drawings for weeds speculate about a number of configurations for flexible and sustainable, yet resistant and complex forms of inhabitation. This includes both plan and section. In a city organized around the primacy of human locomotion, buildings will tend, as they were from the dawn of architecture to the end of the 19th century, to be low and accessible by foot power. In general, this means a default maximum of around 5 stories. Having spent 26 years living on the top floor of a 5-story walk-up building, I can verify that extensive empirical research reveals that this is pretty much the upper limit for regular climbing of stairs, at least by middle-aged Americans. The body-based sustainable city will thus tend to be both dense and low. So much about the fundamental physical requirements of such a city is easily derived. It's possible to offer a very wide variety of solutions to its design based simply on common sense, a logic that simultaneously tests form, use, and respiration. While Weed has some specialized districts, this is the Piazza Navona of Weed, Arizona. This is a concentration of theaters and assembly. This notion that the city can be designed in some detail without precise programming and zoning is something we continue to investigate. Zoning is an artifact of the 19th century, a product of the rise of the industrial city. Although cities have always been zoned in the isolation of royal or sacred quarters, or the communal flourishing of the districts of guilds or crafts, or the delightful block that I observed in Dhaka yesterday in which pets are sold exclusively, the creation of enormous classes of activities and people considered obnoxious is a result of the ecology of industrial capitalism. Smoke-belching factories, fatal rail lines, and restive concentrations of the working class had to be managed spatially, both for efficient production and policing. Our cities remain slaves of these tactics and their specific architectures, infrastructures, and social and spatial relations. Weed, like much of our work, investigates the morphological implications of a newly liberated situation, one in which zoning has lost its primary rationale. The twin imperatives of keeping foul uses and dangerous classes in isolation are now undercut by the prospects of clean production, service-oriented urban economies, tolerance for the presence of the other, and a growing recognition of the decisive role that cities must play in planetary ecology. Now, Weed's forms may be somewhat eccentric, but many of these places are designed recollectively, mixing memory and invention as all architecture must. The spaces are meant to evoke in proportion, dimension, materiality, or feeling some touchstone for successful placemaking. While you may not precisely feel the souks of Fez, the aforementioned Piazza Navona, or the canals of Suzhou, they've registered indelibly on me as places of pleasure, practicality, and harmony, and are my instruments of measure. The design of locality must always begin with living cultures and habits, vital connections between urban forms and lives as people want to live them. Ecological cities will be irresistibly shaped by this vitality and by the specifics of their bioclimatic and topographical situations, refusing the paradigm of sealed, uniform, space capsule architecture predicated on a fundamentally paranoid reading of the environment as the source of discomfort and toxic dread, whether from ISIS, MERS, or a billion tailpipes. Weed also offers an argument for another source of particularity, artistic invention. As local cultures find themselves under increasing duress, originalities of vision must play an increasingly important role. This doesn't mean that every city must be wild and crazy, but it does suggest an unusually liberated situation, that the relationship between freshness and consent is open to new approaches that ally to resist a universalized architecture and human subjectivity, a consumer of Starbucks and McDonald's, where distinction is produced only by the most trivial inflection. Art resists by offering range. One weed might be delightful. A world of them would be a nightmare. The urban work we've been doing seeks to reinstigate the idea of boundedness in light of the demands of sustainability. This is based on a strategy that we call radical harmonization, the outcome both of ideas about bearing capacity, literal levels of local sustainability, and by extension, about political and economic strategies that flirt with the idea of autarky or self-sufficiency. Of course, I don't reject the economics of comparative advantage, but no, we must not retreat behind walls of privilege, indifference, or hostility. Still, I believe that our duty as citizens involves taking direct responsibility for our individual roles in the fate of the earth, and that this demands radical, cooperative self-reliance. Cities, both metaphorically and literally, must therefore engage in forms of local protectionism to foster urban import substitution. This was a concept dear to America's most important urbanist, Jane Jacobs, who believed that this process, import substitution, actually originated cities, as well as being a key and often successful formulation in post-war national development strategies that had considerable success before succumbing to neoliberal repression. The harmonization I have in mind, though, goes beyond questions of protecting infant industries and other local productive capacity to a broader idea about closing environmental loops in key areas of urban respiration. Harmonization is the medium by which limits are set and regulated, and locality is established and affirmed. It is also, and critically, a means to equity, a way for those of us who work in the built environment to internalize and to advance the idea of justice. While it's folly to think that urban design can produce democracy or save the planet on its own, we shouldn't underestimate its power to advance both agendas. Now I'm looking at my little clock here and thinking that it might be wise if I were to not skip but accelerate the middle section of this lecture so I can dilate at greater leisure on the final in New York. This dilemma I'm talking about is particularly clear in China. And say what you will, the results, the sheer rate of transformation there is absolutely amazing. Over the last few decades, hundreds of millions have been lifted from poverty into some version of the middle class, producing the greatest national migration from country to city in all of human history. Unfortunately, most of these migrants have been housed in cities planned on the basis of antique models, inherited first from the Soviets and more recently from ourselves. So I'm going to now show you quickly a city we designed. And we have won so many competitions in China, which have had absolutely zero outcome. In designing this, we began with the metrics of radical harmonization, declaring, in essence, how much of these vital respiratory functions we were going to fulfill to satisfy on the site. by simply using best practices, and our project never incorporates technologies that are not available right now, we were able to effectively shrink the ecological footprint of this city by 50%. Here is the site for the town. It's in a kind of lovely area on the edge of Wuhan, another of the mystery megacities of China, where there are beautiful, pristine lakes, construction on 3 sides, and an existing natural woodland on the other. We divided the site in half, concluding that we would urbanize to the west and use the east productively as farmland and as a source of energy generation. We also decided that leaving that edge clear would allow the infiltration of this park space into the city in order to green it up and tie it. Fairly conventional. It's a series of districts, each anchored by a particular function. Those of you who remember your Jane Jacobs know that 2 major functions must exist in every neighborhood in order to survive, provide vibrancy and dynamism. Those were the primary uses, not entirely determined by us, but each of which instigates a neighborhood. All of them linked, of course, by an efficient and delightful system of public transportation, including trams, ferries, subways, and the like. And then we focused on the design of a couple of the districts. This is a kind of CBD. As you can see, there's a gradient of density, which allows everybody to walk to the lake edge, like Weed, Arizona, but slightly more rationally done. In a matter of 10 minutes, and also a set of morphologies that would, in the successor architectures, allow what we thought would be plenty of variety. You got to fake a few views. These are dreadful. And I include, moment of self-advertising. The idea is, of course, that you design a city. You somehow suggest its massing and general morphological feeling, and then other architects come and execute. So here are some other buildings we've done in China, which might very well appear in this city. This one is in Xi'an. The one before was in Tianjin. That's not a very nice one. The image over there is okay. This one is another apartment complex in Tianjin. Skyscrapers in Xi'an. A wonderful waterfront project in, where the hell is that? Shanghai. Here is another zone in the city where there was an already designated leisure center under construction, which we incorporated. Again, the idea is to make a morphology that's sufficiently variegated, in effect, to coerce. Greetings, my dear. So good to see you. In order to conduce variety and yet retain a kind of consistency. We know great cities not simply by the diversity of their expression, but also by the commonality of their spaces and expressions. A series of Sino-Portofinos lined the lakes in order to provide a special kind of living experience. This is a slide that is migrated in from another project, but is suggestive of the energy farm and research park that might occur on the other side of the site. And now, the denouement of the lecture. For the past decade, Terreform, the non-profit research center, and when I say non-profit, I really mean it, I direct, has been engaged in a thought experiment that investigates the idea of urban harmonization at its outer limits. We've been working to find out what it would mean for New York City to literally take responsibility for all the elements required to sustain itself: food, waste, air, water, climate, construction, energy, and manufacture, not as an abstraction, but as a fact of daily life. The predicate of New York City's steady state is the test of complete self-sufficiency within the city's political boundaries. Our project looks at both the demand and supply sides of urban autonomy, and by pushing as far as we can, we're compiling an encyclopedia of morphologies, technologies, and human practices that will, we hope, be of widespread use to cities around the world. We're motivated to do this by the conviction that independent city-states are utterly critical increments of organization and resistance in a globalizing and indifferent system, and that this work can be an invigorating source of both urban form and social justice. We began with a focus on food. Urban agriculture is a subject of much discussion these days and is obviously fundamental to survival, and it has the added appeal of a certain challenging improbability in the context of the densely built city. We're now almost done with this first volume of the research and have demonstrated that from a purely spatial standpoint, it's possible to produce enough food for 8.5 million people to have at least 2,400 nutritious calories each day grown within the city. This thing grows enough food for 30,000 people in one New York City block at 30 stories. We've also discovered that the environmental, economic, political, cultural, culinary, and morphological arguments for doing this are complex and often completely defy any rational notion of practicality. Nevertheless, our work has investigated sites for production at every scale, including buildings, transformed streets, repurposed infrastructure, existing open spaces, and of course vertical farms. This latter type, constructed in their thousands, would be indispensable to full self-sufficiency in a built-out, bounded city like New York. However, such vertical systems require enormous investment, recast the skyline, are incapable of producing many foods in appropriate quantities, and can be radically impractical. The primary impediment to a genuinely sustainable system of vertical agriculture turns out to be not space, but the extremely high energy inputs needed for illumination and heating, as well as for the massive initial construction, including the energy embodied in their materials. Although enough 30-story agricultural towers, using advanced hydroponic, aeroponic, and other minimalist cultivation techniques, could be built to supply the city with food on about 2% of New York's total land area, a photovoltaic array sufficient to supply them would require an area 3.5 times the total surface area of the city, about 750,000 acres. Alternatively, 25 nuclear power plants would do the job, but that did strike us as being somehow contrary to the spirit of the exercise. Recognizing the impracticality of this arrangement, we've looked at a series of sweet spots that are more aligned with closing neighborhood-scale loops and utilizing viable levels of energy, construction investment, and available land, and always honoring the rights of existing people and communities to remain. We've investigated a variety of morphological transformations at every scale that would characterize a city committed to autonomy and the idea that urban respiration begins locally. One of the speculations that we've pursued is this figure ground switch, in which the 19th century block pattern sees its built mass migrate into the space of the street, freeing the block interiors for agriculture and other public uses. Now, in this first iteration of the idea, the inversion was largely directed to questions of movement and of the public realm, to strategies for reconfiguring the ratio of public to private space in the city. We'd been looking for an outcome that would combine the modernist fantasy of living in towers in the greenery with a more historic idea of the central importance of the street. So this is the flip side of that interior condition. This new pattern is one in which urban circulation has been radically transformed, as you can see, with streets largely removed from the automobile system and to a degree from any form of circulation, with a mix of pedestrians, bikes, trams, buses. Anyway, these streets were imagined as at once post-automotive and pre-modern, and a particular inspiration was the medieval and the Islamic city. When we first tried this out, though, as I say, we saw it too simply. In that initial sketch of a pure figure ground switch, the morphology is attractive, but the real potential for intensive food production is actually very small. We had simply plunged in, devoting too little time to the actual metrics. And if I was going on to you students about the numbers, this is the reason. We hadn't thought enough about the metrics of sufficiency. We soon realized that even if we devoted all of the new terraced rooftops and interior courts to agriculture, the harvest was insufficient to feed more than about 2% of the encompassed population. A more detailed investigation of several blocks in Sunnyside, Queens, greetings to your cousin, revealed the dilemmas. We looked at the transformation with a basic assumption, as I said. The population of the blocks under study must remain constant, and the area of calculation would not exceed the dimensions of the streets and blocks we were looking at. We first tested the 100% scheme, which you saw in an image a few slides back, and the result had stimulating, somewhat Kowloon-like urban flavor, but the vertical farms do present their usual problems. In that scheme, the density of the towers compromises efficient solar access, especially at the lower levels, which means that energy inputs for artificial illumination are substantially increased. One solution is to employ the lower portions of the towers for other uses. Another is to have fewer towers. Both reduce on-site capacity to grow food. And we finally settled on this scheme, which allows 30% of the required food to be grown with a somewhat more gracious internal condition. So the nature of the steady-state economy is revealed in this sort of calculation. Adding residential units to the site means that housing could be subtracted elsewhere in the city, which is useful in reconsidering parts of New York that are built at suburban densities, Staten Island, New York's own suburb, and still heavily dependent on cars. Energy, however, isn't entirely fungible. It's tied to the site of its thermodynamic conversion, whether in a car, an air conditioner, or a light bulb. Using additional energy to up food production has implications for citywide conservation and production strategies. And if most of the food is coming from off-site, this ramifies in bigger strategies for provisioning the city as a whole. In the case of this Sunnyside, Queens instance, the switched blocks turn out to be adjacent to one of the very large vertical farm complexes we're proposing, which are above a vast railway yard, which is near enough to that site to be part of any local aggregation and disaggregation scheme. In the same spirit, this same site might be used for solar arrays to power the vertical farms, or simply to plug into the increasingly autonomous city electrical grid we imagine. So we've looked at many specific architectures and solutions and have designed prototype vertical farms for animal production, various smaller scale greenhouses, wall systems, and other elements of what is now a fairly well-developed repertoire of urban agrarian resources. We've looked at the way in which these structures and techniques can be integrated into the fabric of the city, and have been particularly interested in the reclaiming of the space of the street from an automobile-dominated movement culture for a broader mix of public uses, including such immobile examples as agriculture. We've looked at all scales, from window boxes to these skyscraper farms, in order to suggest a system in which population is not monopolized by the urban equivalent of agribusiness, something this whole project obviously implicitly intends to critique. And we're perfectly aware of how tempting a target millions of square feet of municipally developed automated vertical farms would be for Archer's, Daniels, Midland, or Monsanto, or any of the evil agribusiness corporations. The final page. We've now investigated scenarios for reconfiguring the city as a whole to allow it to grow 100% of its food supply to help tease out what will be genuinely new in the organization of radically sustainable cities. The main means of production include large areas of vertical farms, particularly in portions of the city that are currently built at suburban densities, figure ground switches, overbuilding of highway and rail infrastructures, and intensive utilization of rooftops, vacant lots, brown fields, and other available space. However, our larger reimagining of the city is based on an intensification of neighborhood autonomy. Our objective is to scale self-reliance downwards wherever possible, and we have a strong preference for local accountability in all aspects of urban respiration, from energy to sewage. Our drawings of New York reorganized are diagrammatic. We don't imagine a literally circular morphology for these transformed neighborhoods, but we do intend that all neighborhoods be recalibrated on the basis of walk time. The emergence of a green supergrid as a zone of circulation, agriculture, climate control, recreation, water management, and organization. We're also in the process of designing a repurposed subway system to facilitate, finally, not simply the movement of people, but of goods. And we're also looking at larger scaled sweet spots, and we've studied a scheme for, as I said, 30% production of food within the city, a scheme for 100% production within a 100-mile agricultural radius, and finally, a last scheme for a New York statewide system that would utilize the revival of a great piece of 19th century infrastructure, the Erie Canal. With some luck and a little help from our friends, we hope, God willing, to finish this project in the next 5 years and to offer the results to citizens and cities around the world that seek to preserve, enhance, and to share what that incredibly hip Pope Francis has eloquently called our common home. The end. Thank you very much.
Tell us a bit about the next Helsinki project and the impacts that it has had.
Many of you may know that there was recently a competition held in Helsinki for a Guggenheim museum. And somebody, the Guggenheim obviously, persuaded the municipality of Helsinki that they too could enjoy the so-called Bilbao effect if only they would hand over 100 million euros to the Guggenheim to run a competition and build a building. The next Helsinki competition was a counter competition that was organized by 3 groups, something called Checkpoint Helsinki, which is a local arts organization in Helsinki, Terreform, and an organization called Gulf, which has been protesting the labor practices of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. So we simply asked we asked 2 questions. One, is this American Art Museum the highest and best use of an incredibly tasty site on the harbor of Helsinki? And 2, in an advanced and egalitarian social democracy, is spending that kind of money on an American art museum the best way to encourage the arts? We got about 300 submissions, a very excellent bunch of projects. Some of them architectural, some of them literary, some of them wildly speculative in one way or another. And we have compiled them and will publish them as a book in a couple of months. So urpub.org will give you access to the publishing venture out there.
You've worked in China, you've worked in the United States. One's, a autocracy, that can tell the people what to do and can move masses around to achieve any result that they want to achieve. The other is a alleged democracy that has all the messy vitality of challenge and ebb and flow and all of that. And you've seen the successes and or failures, in both. And maybe you could talk a little bit about, the advantages of how the successes happen in one or the other. But more importantly, I think for this audience, is something that we've been struggling with, here when we come to Dhaka. What political circumstance, can enable the the revitalization and the proper urbanization of Dhaka?
The American asks the other American. There you go. This is when traveling and giving lectures, this is the question you most dread.
I was invited here to set you up.
Just give us your advice. What can I say? Stop filling in the wetlands. What's happening in China is in many ways remarkable and positive. Many people are being lifted in poverty, lifted out of poverty, but they are being moved into urban circumstances that are perhaps not ideal. Even so, so many anecdotes about weighing the kind of cost benefit between losing your life and tight bonds of affinity in the village in order to have indoor plumbing. Now that's not a kind of slam dunk argument. So China is in a unique circumstance in which there is this convergence of centralized authority and cheap labor, and they're able to do something big, and they're doing it. And
it's a social experiment.
Well, sure, it's a social experiment, but it's not 100% different from the social experiment that we conducted in the United States in the years immediately after the Second World War, in which we decided that another paradigm was ideal, which was the good for General Motors, automobile-dependent, individual house suburb, which we coerced into being through a variety of state measures. So we built the interstate system. We gave extremely cheap financing to white veterans of the Second World War. We instituted accelerated depreciation arrangements for commercial properties. So this complex of government interventions effectively produced the suburb as the default condition of life in the United States of America for 30 years. And it had the corollary effect of destroying most of our cities. So the test of an induced paradigm is not always something that can be answered, at the moment of its creation. Because, one cannot gainsay. I'm of the generation. I have two New York parents. Wanted to, thought the city was kind of a blighted place. Moved to the suburbs. God bless them. They didn't want to move out. So it's possible that these are questions that we cannot answer definitively. But yes, there is a great and weird experiment going on in China, just as there is at the periphery of Dhaka. I mean, any city that is enlarging itself exponentially is obliged to try a variety of moves. So one tries to learn from other people's experiences. One thing we know about the suburbs, for example, is that there's something, architects in particular, have a very hard time crediting the idea that other people's choices are legitimate. So, I mean, it took me a very long time to realize that there are people who actually prefer dark apartments, or to live on the lower floor rather than a higher floor. So, on the one hand, it's a kind of pathetic psychological adventure of trying to put yourself in the mind of the other. On the other hand, what I think I was arguing for in terms of this notion of the loft city is one wants to create cities that conduce the maximum number of uncoerced and pleasurable, shall we say, possibilities for everyone.
You talked about just a few minutes ago the filling of the wetlands. Do you think the sustainability is at stake when you physically change and fill up these wetlands? for specifically a city like Dhaka? And if so, what would be the role of an architect who were designing, taking time to build independent buildings in a small plot or large plot within the city limits? Would that, is that an ostrich kind of attitude? Like you stick your head in the sand and thinking no one is seeing you while you're practicing? Or would that be enough with building right now? Now let's take care of the periphery so that when it comes to build a sustainable city for the true meaning, that's when we should build. How would the practice be looked at?
I get back to that tired slogan, you know, think globally, act locally. So I mean, the worst thing that you can do is to persuade yourself that there's nothing you can do. So I think one intervenes at whatever scale one is in a position to intervene. So I have no definitive answer to this question other than buck up, man. Capture some rainwater. Use low embodied energy materials. Let the aquifer be recharged rather than run off into the sewer. I have no non-self-evident answer to your question, and it was a rhetorical question in the first place. So you've gotten what you deserve. But to identify as an architect is not to say that you haven't responsibilities as a citizen. There are many issues that cannot be solved at the level of form making. So, into the streets.
Hi, Michael. I have a question about the last project you've shown about urban autonomy, you said. And as I could understand, you talked about food production and energy. So one question is, how do you think about the society while thinking of that? For example, do you expect everyone to be farmers? And another thing is, you're saying that this can be a model which other cities can follow. And do you think cities in Bangladesh or India in the future would require that type of thinking or interventions?
As I said, the reason we undertook the project is that you saw the poster. I mean, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. We are hyper-consumers in America. You are consuming far less. There is a condition of radical inequality, and the attempts to solve this politically don't seem to be going anywhere. So this is a proposition about looking at a kind of the most consumption-intensive environment on the planet, and looking at how far we could go in order to take responsibility for our own impact on the planet. And in the course of doing this, we hope to compile this big encyclopedia that will be more generally useful. So we are looking not just at food and energy, but at air, water, climate, manufacturing, the kind of full range of things that a true city-state might produce. It is a kind of radically political question, of course, and that's the basis for our intervention. I just came from Singapore. I gave a talk at this World Architecture, what is it, something, WAF, the WAF, Wild World Architecture Festival. And so Singapore, is very interested in securing its own autonomy. They have a kind of a fantasy of themselves as a city-state, as indeed they are. And they have recently secured autonomy in water supply. And in order to do this, they have built, they capture a certain amount of rainwater, they reprocess, they have a gray water system, but they also have two gigantic desalination plants, which are extremely costly in terms of energy. So in order to power those two desalination plants, they have to import huge quantities of LNG from the Gulf. So they have decided, in terms of their fantasy of sovereignty, that it's much more important to them not to have to depend on the Malaysians for their water supply, than it is to have to depend on the Gulf Arabs for their energy supply. So these questions are complex, and that's one of the things that we discovered. I mean, we thought going into the food investigation that space would be the absolute problem, but the kind of vertical agriculture technology in terms of both the growing technology and the building technology, it's easy. It's easy, but it's incredibly expensive, and it's incredibly energy inefficient. So but this is where the rubber hits the road. I am trying to make an argument that it's too late. It's like carbon credits, trading carbon credits. The idea that somehow you can cut a deal that allows you to continue with your bad habits, and somebody else is going to take up the slack for you. I think it's too late for those deals. The fact that four-planet image, that's the reality, and somehow, I can't tell you. Your Bangladesh is already, a model of good environmental stewardship in the sense that you're simply not consuming as much. We don't have much. Huh? Well, yeah. So I mean, but this is an interesting paradox. It's kind of, it's not for me to say that you are because you are suffering and you haven't gotten it together to have a Buick in every garage. You must renounce the ambition, but somehow we're going to have to. We hyper-consumers are going to have to give up a lot, there's no other way. But let us look at the forms of creativity that will enable a kind of radical responsibility taking. Now, I think at the end of the day that New York transformed by a really elaborate attention to its respiratory functions is going to be a much more interesting place. We had this discussion yesterday or 2 days ago, whenever it was. I mean, one of the kind of anomalous things about New York is that it is the most energy efficient city in the United States, or the second most. As discussed, that you wouldn't think this seems improbable, right? Given the level of energy and consumption, but there's a single factor that's responsible for this, and it goes back to this argument about density, and also an argument about civic responsibility, collectivity, and government intervention, and it is that we have an incredible public transit system, and we are by far the greatest users of public transit of any place in the United States, and this single phenomenon has a radical impact on our rates of energy consumption compared to the suburbs, for example. So we know that in terms of almost every sustainable consideration, the suburbs is about the worst thing you can do. I mean, the amount of infrastructure, the energy inefficiency, the dependence on the automobile, and so on and so on and so on. So, there are good arguments for density. It's not the be-all and end-all. Density is valuable not as an absolute, but it's valuable in terms of what it's capable of producing. In the case of New York, it's capable of producing a mass transit system that is itself then capable of producing both energy efficiency and ultimately, in our formulation, of producing a kind of radically new kind of street life that we think is the core of what it means to live in a good city.
While looking at your last projects in China and in New York, it reminded me of a draft plan that I came across recently. It's a new draft plan for Dhaka. And it actually resembles with the ideas that you have implemented, that is the polycentric developments based on the walking distance and connecting those through mass transits. So I was just curious to know that when I'm talking about a new city, a newly planned city, I can implement anything, any idea. But when I'm talking about Dhaka in its present state, do you really feel that this kind of ideas are really possible? I mean, how much we can retrofit the Dhaka in its present state, or in any city like Dhaka?
Well, I don't want to give you a glib answer, but one of the answers is as much as you want. So we were driving over here through the fabulous Dhaka traffic, and we're having a conversation about neighborhoods immediately surrounding this one, in which apparently in a very short space of time you've gone from a kind of default of 4 stories to a default of 15 stories. So these enormous transformations are taking place right in front of you. And the idea that this is just the invisible hand doing its thing, think again. These are conscious decisions about the future of the city, just as it is a conscious decision to fill in a flood-prone city, to fill in wetlands in order to make high-rise apartments that require the ownership of a car. This is a decision. I'm going to go out on a limb. This is a bad decision that somebody in the municipality or some complex of interest in the municipality have made. So yeah, you can do a million things, at all different scales. Part of the issue is to think about the ways in which Dhaka finds a new kind of particularity. Dhaka today, at 17 or 20, whatever million it is obviously a very different place than Dhaka 50 years ago. But it's still the process of constructing Dhaka-ness. That's what you architects are meant to be doing in Dhaka. And let's not mystify it too much. I noticed that a lot of people were coughing during my lecture. I obviously take some of my responsibility for that. It's boredom, it's a reflex. On the other hand, possible the air quality is less than ideal. You think, literally 1.5 million people died last year.
Maybe it's the change of weather.
Huh?
I mean, the weather is changing.
Oh, the weather is changing.
I do not agree with the air thing yet.
Okay. So I'm delighted to hear that the air quality is good in Dhaka. Nevertheless, I was in Beijing to give a talk a couple of years ago during the APEC conference, and the top leadership is thinking, I can't see my hand in front of my face, think things are really bad here. What's the world going to think of us? And they decided, let's fix it for these foreign leaders. And in a week, now they refer to it as APEC Blue in China. Shut down all the factories, looked at all the coal burning plants upwind, banned half the cars, and voila, the sky was blue. So but this demonstrates something. That miracles are both possible and in some senses easy, if you want it.
Good evening, and I think I have the privilege of asking the last question. It's really hard to ask you any question because you have covered almost everything.
Yeah, because I have all the answers, right?
Yeah, so since yesterday, I've been thinking all about sustainability and what we are going to do or what are the options. So now I'm going to ask you about the recent project that is ongoing, the New York City State. I would ask, how did you make the policymakers or the client accept your proposal? The policymakers to accept your proposal and give it a green light?
Well, yeah, good question. No, we are strong believers in the propaganda value both of a seductive image and of a good idea. So we are making an argument, and it may be naive, but I have some sense that a compellingly framed argument supported by much evidence, is an important part of the discourse of politics and of social life. So we are making arguments for a future that I think many people would like to share in, which is a future about not just sustainability, but by implication, a future about equity and about harmony and about living in beautiful places. So I think that, that there are these. The most interesting thing I said is this. I think is this idea of the nature of a complete neighborhood. So we think first in terms of a complete neighborhood, as an array of services. It's got a school and a park and a playground and a shop and some offices. Then we think about the complete neighborhood in terms of these respiratory functions. It's remediating its waste, it's generating its energy, it's capturing rainfall, it's growing food. But then, most importantly, we think about a complete neighborhood in terms of the accessibility of that neighborhood to everybody who provides those services and teaches at that school and studies there. And that's the radical implication of the thing. If you were looking to solve, and you always have to look first at the demand side of the equation and thinking about sustainability. If you want everybody to walk to work, then everybody needs to live near work, which means that everybody who works has to live together. If there's a kind of utopian register to the project, I think it's about neighborliness, because at the end of the day, I think that's what our argument is all about. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.